Night has fallen over the Florida coast. The Atlantic is black and endless, stretching out beneath a sky scattered with stars. Along the shoreline, thousands of people stand shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on a distant shape rising from the launch pad at Cape Canaveral. Floodlights illuminate a towering rocket, taller than the Statue of Liberty, gleaming white against the darkness. Steam drifts from its sides as liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen churn through the fueling lines. At its base, 4 engines wait in silence. This rocket carries a name that echoes through history: Artemis. More than 50 years ago, humanity last set foot on the moon. The final Apollo astronauts left behind footprints in the gray dust, climbed back into their spacecraft, and returned home. Since that moment in 1972, no human being has walked on another world. For half a century, the moon has remained quiet. But on this night, that silence is about to end. Inside NASA's Launch Control Center, engineers sit at their consoles watching streams of telemetry flow across their screens. Every system is monitored, every valve, every computer, every sensor across a rocket the size of a skyscraper. The countdown clock ticks toward 0. This mission is more than a test flight. It is the beginning of something far bigger than Apollo ever was. Artemis is not just about visiting the moon again, it is about staying. For the first time in human history, we are preparing to build a permanent presence beyond Earth, a lunar space station. Surface habitats, regular missions carrying astronauts and cargo across the 250,000 miles between Earth and the moon. And someday, from those footholds on the lunar surface, humanity will push even farther toward Mars. But first, the journey has to begin. At T-minus 10 seconds, the countdown enters its final phase. 9, 8, 7. The hydrogen burn-off, igniters erupt beneath the engines, flashing like lightning across the pad. 6, 5, 4, 3. The engines ignite in a blinding explosion of fire and sound. 2, 1. The most powerful rocket ever built by NASA rises slowly from the pad, climbing into the night sky. A new chapter of exploration has begun. This is Artemis, and this is the story of humanity's return to the moon.
Welcome to Orbital Briefing, the podcast where we explore the missions, the people, and the science that built humanity's journey into space. From Mercury to Artemis, we dive deep into the stories behind the rockets that carried us beyond Earth. This is Orbital Briefing.
Mission Control. Mission Control Message. Orbital Briefing is supported by the book The American Spaceplane, a story of ambition, risk, and reinvention. The space shuttle was designed to make spaceflight routine. Instead, it reshaped America's relationship with space. This book explores the full story of the shuttle program, from the political decisions that shaped its design, to the engineers and astronauts who brought the vehicle to life, and the triumphs and tragedies that defined an era of exploration. The American Spaceplane is available now on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and ebook. Mission Control out.
For decades after the final Apollo mission, the moon remained a symbol of what humanity had achieved, but also a reminder of how far we had stepped back. When Apollo 17 lifted off from the lunar surface in December of 1972, it marked the end of the most ambitious exploration program ever attempted. 12 astronauts had walked on the moon. Hundreds of thousands of engineers and technicians had made it possible. But once the race with the Soviet Union was won, the political urgency faded, the Saturn V rockets were retired, the Apollo hardware was placed in museums, and human exploration moved into low Earth orbit with the Space Shuttle and later the International Space Station. For nearly 50 years, the moon remained untouched by human footsteps. But the dream of returning never fully disappeared. In the decades that followed Apollo, NASA engineers studied new ways to go back to the moon, not just for short visits, but to stay. The moon offered something Apollo never attempted: the opportunity to build a permanent presence beyond Earth. Then, in the 21st century, the idea began to take shape once again. In 2017, the United States formally announced a new lunar exploration program. Its name was Artemis, a fitting choice drawn from Greek mythology. In legend, Artemis was a twin sister of Apollo. Now, more than half a century after the Apollo program first reached the moon, Artemis would return humanity there. But this time, the goal was different. Apollo was designed to prove it could be done. Astronauts would land, conduct experiments, collect samples, and leave. Artemis is designed to build something lasting. At the heart of the program is a long-term vision, a sustainable human presence on and around the moon. Artemis missions will establish infrastructure in lunar orbit and on the lunar surface, allowing astronauts to return again and again, not just for days, but eventually for months at a time. A small space station called the Lunar Gateway will orbit the moon, serving as a staging point for missions to the surface. New landing systems will carry astronauts down to regions of the moon never explored before, including the mysterious South Polar region, where frozen water may exist inside permanently shadowed craters. And over time, NASA and its international partners hope to construct something that would have been unimaginable during the Apollo era: a permanent base on the moon, habitats where astronauts can live and work, power systems that can operate through the long lunar night, robotic vehicles and scientific laboratories exploring the surface. The moon will become more than a destination. It will become a proving ground. Because Artemis is not only about returning to the moon, it is about preparing humanity for the next great leap in exploration. Everything learned from building and operating a lunar base, life support systems, deep space navigation, surface operations, long-duration missions far from Earth, will be essential for the next destination, Mars. For the first time in history, humanity is not just planning missions beyond Earth orbit. We are planning to live there. And Artemis is the program designed to make that future possible. The Artemis program is not a single launch, and it is not a single flag and footprints moment. It is a campaign, a deliberate, step-by-step effort to rebuild humanity's ability to travel beyond Earth orbit, operate in deep space, return to the lunar surface, and eventually remain there for the long term. Apollo proved that we could reach the moon. Artemis is designed to prove that we can go back, build there, and keep going. Each mission in the sequence is meant to unlock the next one. Each launch is a test, a rehearsal, or an expansion of what came before. The hardware, the procedures, the docking operations, the life support systems, and the launch cadence all have to work together if NASA is ever going to transform the moon from a destination into an outpost. That process began with Artemis I. In 2022, Artemis I launched without a crew aboard. It was the first full-scale test of the Space Launch System rocket and the Orion spacecraft, the backbone of NASA's deep space architecture. The mission sent Orion far beyond the moon and brought it safely home, proving that the spacecraft could survive the radiation environment of deep space, navigate at lunar distances, and endure the brutal heat of re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. Artemis I was not about headlines. It was about confidence. Before astronauts could climb aboard, NASA had to know that the machine itself could make the journey. Next comes Artemis II. Artemis II is the mission that returns human beings to deep space for the first time since the Apollo era. 4 astronauts will board Orion and fly around the moon, testing the spacecraft's life support systems, communications, navigation, and crew operations in the environment where those systems actually have to perform. This is the proving flight for people, not just hardware. It is the moment Artemis stops being an engineering program on paper and becomes a human mission in the fullest sense. NASA has described Artemis II as the first crewed test flight under the Artemis campaign, intended to confirm the systems needed for the missions that follow. Then comes one of the most important changes in the entire program. Under NASA's updated architecture announced in February 2026, Artemis III is no longer being framed as the first landing mission. Instead, it is now designed to test systems and operational capabilities in low Earth orbit. That means Artemis III will serve as a critical rehearsal, a chance to prove that Orion, the lander architecture, and the docking procedures can work together in space before astronauts commit to a lunar landing attempt farther from home. This may not sound as dramatic as stepping onto the moon, but in some ways it is exactly the kind of mission Artemis needs. Lunar exploration in the 21st century is far more complex than Apollo. Multiple vehicles have to rendezvous. Systems built by different contractors have to integrate cleanly. Docking has to be precise. Crew transfers have to be safe. Artemis III is where that choreography gets tested, and after that, Artemis IV is now expected to become the mission that returns astronauts to the lunar surface. If all goes according to plan, Artemis IV will take the lessons learned from Artemis III and turn them into the first crewed lunar landing of the Artemis era. This is where the campaign reconnects directly with the legacy of Apollo, not by repeating it, but by extending it. The landing itself will matter enormously, of course. It will mark the first human return to the moon in more than half a century. But in the broader logic of Artemis, it is also something else. The first real field deployment of a system meant to be used again and again. NASA's revised architecture now points toward Artemis IV in 2028 as the first landing under this updated sequence. Artemis V pushes that idea even further. By the time Artemis V flies, the goal is no longer simply to return. The goal is to normalize returning, to make lunar missions more repeatable, more sustainable, more operational. Artemis V is expected to continue surface exploration and help expand the larger system taking shape around the moon, the transportation network, the orbital infrastructure, the landers, the procedures, and eventually the habits of working in deep space on a regular basis. NASA has already said the Artemis campaign is intended to send astronauts on increasingly difficult missions to explore more of the moon and build the foundation for Mars. And that long-term cadence may be the most important part of all. NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman has made clear that he does not want Artemis remembered as a short list of isolated prestige missions. He has talked about a future where the program grows into something much larger, not a handful of launches spread across decades, but potentially hundreds of missions over time. If Apollo was a sprint to prove that humanity could reach another world, Isaacman's vision suggests Artemis could become the transportation framework that makes cislunar space a place we visit again and again. That kind of future would not just mean returning to the moon, it would mean opening a permanent corridor between Earth and the lunar frontier. That is what makes Artemis different from Apollo. Apollo was magnificent but temporary. Artemis is being built to last. Mission by mission, test by test, docking by docking, landing by landing. NASA is trying to create something humanity has never had before. Not just the ability to touch another world, but the ability to keep going back until that world becomes part of our permanent sphere of activity. The rocket is the symbol, the missions are the milestones, but the machine Artemis is really trying to build is bigger than any one spacecraft. It is the system that could one day support a moon base, routine travel beyond Earth orbit, and the first human voyage to Mars. Human spaceflight is always described in terms of machines: the rocket, the capsule, the engines, the countdown. But every mission, no matter how advanced the hardware becomes, is still a story about people. Artemis is no different. Behind the towering white rocket on the launch pad is an entire generation of astronauts, engineers, controllers, managers, and decision makers carrying the weight of something historic. They are not just preparing for a mission, they are preparing to reopen deep space to human beings. At the center of that effort is the Artemis II crew. Reed Wiseman will command the mission. Calm, experienced, and measured, Wiseman represents the kind of steady leadership NASA has always relied on when the stakes are high. As commander, he is responsible not only for the flight itself, but for setting the tone of the mission, disciplined, precise, and ready for the unexpected. On Artemis II, he will be the first person in more than 50 years to command a human voyage outward toward the moon. Beside him will be Victor Glover, serving as pilot. Glover's presence on Artemis II carries significance on multiple levels. He is a naval aviator, a test pilot, and an astronaut with a technical skill to help guide Orion through one of the most demanding crewed missions NASA has attempted in generations. But he also represents the expanding story of who gets to be part of lunar exploration. Artemis has been framed from the beginning as a program meant to open the next era of exploration to a broader America than the one reflected in Apollo. And Glover is a powerful part of that story. Christina Koch brings another kind of strength to the crew. She is already part of spaceflight history, known for her long-duration mission aboard the International Space Station and for helping redefine what endurance in orbit looks like. On Artemis II, she becomes part of an even larger moment. one of the astronauts helping lead humanity back into deep space. Coke brings experience, resilience, and credibility to a mission that must prove Orion is ready for people, not just for test hardware and engineering models. Her role is not symbolic. It is operational, technical, and essential. Then there is Jeremy Hansen of the Canadian Space Agency. His place on Artemis II reminds us that this is not simply an American return to the moon. Artemis is international by design. Hansen's inclusion reflects the broader coalition behind the program, allies, agencies, and industries working together to build what Apollo never did, a long-term architecture beyond Earth. In Hansen, the mission gains not only another skilled astronaut, but a visible reminder that the road back to the moon is being built by more than one nation. Together, these 4 astronauts are more than a crew manifest. They are the human face of a transition. They stand between 2 eras, the age when the moon belonged to history, and the age when it may once again become a destination for living, working, and building. But astronauts are only the most visible people in the story. Long before Artemis II leaves the ground, another figure will already be at the center of the action, Charlie Blackwell-Thompson. If the astronauts are the public face of Artemis, Charlie Blackwell-Thompson is one of the steady hands behind the curtain, making sure the entire machine actually moves. As NASA's Artemis launch director, she is responsible for integrating and coordinating launch operations across the Space Launch System, Orion, and Exploration Ground Systems. She led the countdown and liftoff of Artemis I, and as NASA's first female launch director, she occupies a place in the program that is both historic and deeply practical. When the countdown clock is running, hers is one of the voices that matters most. And that matters because Artemis is not an era of simple missions. Apollo was complex, but its architecture was relatively direct. Launch, travel, land, return. Artemis is something larger and more interdependent. The launch campaign alone involves ground systems teams, flight control teams, mission managers, software specialists, propulsion experts, safety officers, and recovery crews spread across multiple NASA centers and contractor teams. Charlie Blackwell-Thompson sits at the crossroads of all of that complexity. She does not merely watch a rocket launch. She helps orchestrate one of the most difficult operational performances in modern spaceflight. The same is true of the broader leadership guiding Artemis forward. Now, that leadership includes NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman. Isaacman comes to NASA not only as an administrator, but as a pilot and commercial astronaut with firsthand experience in modern spaceflight. That gives him a somewhat different profile than many past NASA leaders. He speaks the language of government programs, but also of tempo, iteration, and scale. Under his leadership, Artemis is being talked about not as a short series of symbolic missions, but as the beginning of a transportation system, one that could eventually support a sustained presence on the moon and far more missions than the public once imagined. That shift in tone is important. It suggests NASA is no longer thinking only in terms of returning. It is thinking in terms of permanence. And beyond the names the public knows are thousands more most people will never hear. The engineers designing docking systems, the technicians stacking boosters, the controllers rehearsing off-nominal scenarios in darkened rooms, the recovery teams waiting in the Pacific, the managers balancing risk, schedule, and political pressure. The men and women who will make a go or no-go decision not with speeches, but with checklists, telemetry, and years of earned judgment. That is the real cast of Artemis, not just heroes in spacesuits, but professionals across an enormous system, all trying to do something that has not been done since the early 1970s, and to do it in a way that lasts. Because if Artemis succeeds, history will not remember only the astronauts who flew. It will remember the people who made deep space human again. History does not always announce itself with a single moment. Sometimes it begins with a silence that has lasted for decades. For more than 50 years after Apollo 17 left the moon in December of 1972, no human being traveled beyond low Earth orbit. The pathways to deep space that had once seemed open were allowed to narrow, then fade, until the moon became less a destination than a memory. a place preserved in film reels, museum hardware, and the grainy black and white ghosts of another era. Artemis is the campaign meant to break that silence. The modern mission log truly begins with Artemis I. In November of 2022, NASA launched the most powerful rocket it had built since the Saturn era and sent Orion on an uncrewed journey around the moon. This was the proof of concept mission, the one that had to work before anything else could follow. Orion traveled far beyond the moon, entered a distant retrograde orbit, spent weeks in deep space, and then came home through the furnace of re-entry before splashing down safely in the Pacific in December. Artemis I did not carry astronauts, but it carried something almost as important: the burden of proving that America's new deep space system was real. That success moved the campaign into its next and far more personal phase, Artemis II. NASA's current plan is for Artemis II to launch in 2026 as the first crewed mission of the program, sending 4 astronauts around the moon on an approximately 10-day flight. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen will ride Orion into deep space and become the first human beings since the Apollo era to leave Earth orbit and head toward lunar distance. They will not land. That is not the point of this mission. Artemis II is about proving that Orion can sustain a crew, protect them, communicate with Earth across vast distance, and bring them home safely. It is the step where the spacecraft stops being a machine under test and becomes, once again, a vessel for human exploration. But the mission log takes an important turn after that. In February of 2026, NASA updated the Artemis architecture and inserted a new kind of mission into the sequence. Under that revised plan, Artemis III is now intended as a low Earth orbit demonstration flight rather than the first lunar landing. That may sound like a step sideways, but in reality, it is a recognition of how complex modern lunar exploration has become. Artemis III is expected to test rendezvous and docking, with one or both commercial landers being developed by SpaceX and Blue Origin, along with integrated checkouts of life support, communications, propulsion, and even the new lunar spacesuits. In other words, Artemis III becomes the rehearsal for the system the moment NASA proves that the pieces can work together before sending astronauts all the way to lunar orbit and the surface beyond, and that sets the stage for Artemis IV. Under NASA's current plan, Artemis IV is now targeted as the first Artemis lunar landing mission, with NASA continuing to aim for early 2028. If Artemis II proves the crewed spacecraft, and Artemis III proves the choreography between Orion and the commercial landing systems, then Artemis IV becomes the long-awaited return itself, the moment astronauts once again descend to the lunar surface after more than half a century away. But even here, Artemis is not trying to recreate Apollo shot for shot. This landing is meant to be part of a broader campaign, one mission in a developing architecture that is supposed to be used repeatedly, improved over time, and extended into something sustainable. Then comes Artemis V, where returning starts to become routine, or at least more routine than it has ever been in human history. NASA's public framing of Artemis V is still part of an evolving architecture, but the broad direction is clear. Keep building the cadence, keep refining the landing systems, keep expanding the human reach around and on the moon. Artemis V is part of the phase where the campaign stops being a dramatic comeback and starts trying to become an operating model. More surface missions, more infrastructure, more experience, more repetition. That is how a moon base eventually becomes possible. Not from one triumphant landing, but from a chain of missions that slowly turns exploration into presence. And that may be the real significance of this mission log. For most of the space age, missions beyond Earth orbit were singular events. Apollo 8, Apollo 11, Apollo 17, each one historic, each one extraordinary, and each one temporary. Artemis is trying to create something different. NASA has said the campaign is intended to send astronauts on increasingly difficult missions, explore more of the moon, and build the foundation for the first crewed mission to Mars. Under Jared Isaacman, the rhetoric has widened even further, toward a future where Artemis is not just a handful of missions, but the beginning of a much larger transportation framework between Earth and the moon. So the mission log of Artemis is not just a sequence of launch dates, it is a progression of confidence. First, prove the machine can fly, then prove people can survive the journey, then prove the vehicles can find each other, dock, transfer crews, and operate as one system, then land, then go back. And after that, keep going until the idea of traveling to the moon no longer feels like the work of a vanished golden age, but the beginning of a new normal.
Mission Control Update. Orbital Briefing is supported by the American Spaceplane, a story of ambition, risk, and reinvention, a book exploring the rise, triumphs, and legacy of the Space Shuttle program. From the engineers who designed it to the astronauts who flew it, the story of the shuttle is a story of ambition, risk, and the pursuit of routine access to space. Available now on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and ebook. Mission Control, returning you to the mission.
What makes Artemis matter is not simply that it returns astronauts to the moon. What makes it matter is that it changes the meaning of the moon itself. During Apollo, the moon was a finish line. It was the place the United States needed to reach first, prove it could reach, and then leave behind. Apollo was one of the greatest achievements in human history, but it was built around a short-term objective: land, explore, collect, return. It was never designed to create a lasting human presence beyond Earth. Artemis is different. Artemis is built around the idea that the moon should no longer be treated as a one-time destination, but as the first permanent frontier beyond our planet. NASA's stated goal is not just lunar exploration for its own sake, but to use the moon as a place to learn how human beings can live and work on another world over the long term. That includes surface operations, power systems, mobility, communications, life support, and the ability to sustain crews farther from Earth than ever before. That is why the South Pole matters. Unlike the equatorial landing sites of Apollo, the Artemis campaign is focused heavily on the lunar South Polar region, where permanently shadowed craters may contain water ice. That ice could be used for drinking water, breathable oxygen, and even rocket propellant. In other words, the moon may offer some of the raw materials needed to support a sustained human presence. If that proves true, the moon stops being only a place we visit and starts becoming a place we can use as a stepping stone. And that leads directly to the larger ambition behind the program. The real destination beyond Artemis is Mars. NASA has repeatedly framed Artemis as part of a broader Moon-to-Mars strategy, using lunar missions to develop the systems and operational experience needed for eventual human expeditions to the Red Planet. A moon base, or even the early stages of one, would allow space agencies and commercial partners to test exactly the kinds of technologies Mars will require: long-duration habitation, surface exploration, radiation protection, resource utilization, and complex logistics far from Earth. Artemis matters because it is not only about where we are going next, it is about how we learn to go farther than we ever have before. There is also a deeper historical significance here. For more than half a century, humanity has lived with a strange contradiction. We have known since the 1960s that we are capable of reaching another world. And yet, for generations, we did not return. The moon became proof of our greatness, but also proof of our inconsistency. Artemis is an attempt to resolve that contradiction. It is a declaration that deep space exploration should not belong to one brief era of history. It should be part of the future. It matters politically. It matters scientifically. It matters technologically. But beyond all of that, Artemis matters because it asks a civilizational question. Are we a species that visited another world once? Or are we a species that is finally learning how to leave home for good? That is the real weight of Artemis, not just the rocket on the pad, not just the astronauts in Orion, not just the first landing that will eventually come. The true importance of Artemis is that it may mark the moment when humanity stops treating deep space as an impossible distance and starts treating it as the next place we intend to build. There is something almost haunting about Artemis, not because it is new, but because it is familiar. The shapes are different. The computers are smaller and more powerful. The spacecraft are built with materials and software the Apollo generation could only have imagined. The mission architecture is more complex, more international, and more ambitious in its long-term goals. And yet, at the center of it all, the image still feels strangely recognizable. A rocket on the pad in Florida, a crew preparing to leave Earth, and a nation once again looking toward the moon. Artemis is NASA's modern Moon-to-Mars campaign, meant to return humans to the lunar vicinity, build towards sustained lunar operations, and prepare for future missions to Mars. That is what gives Artemis its emotional weight. It is not merely a new program, it is a conversation with history. For more than half a century, Apollo has stood almost alone in the public imagination, a shining peak of achievement, admired precisely because it seemed impossible to repeat. The men who walked on the moon became figures of legend, and the missions themselves took on the quality of myth. Artemis does not erase that legacy, and it does not try to outshine it. Instead, it does something more interesting. It answers Apollo. It says that the story did not end in December of 1972. It says that the moon was never meant to remain a monument to a lost age. And maybe that is the deepest truth in all of this. Apollo proved that humanity could reach another world. Artemis is trying to prove that humanity can return with intention. Not for a brief victory lap, not for a single headline, not for one dramatic planting of a flag, but to build experience, to test systems, to create routine, to turn exploration into infrastructure. NASA's current architecture update reflects exactly that philosophy. Artemis III is being used to test integrated systems in low Earth orbit before Artemis IV attempts the next lunar landing, part of a broader plan aimed at an enduring presence and a higher mission cadence over time. That matters because permanence changes everything. A moon mission is extraordinary. A moon program is historic. But a sustained pathway between Earth and the moon, one that carries crews, cargo, technology, and eventually the first building blocks of a lunar base, begins to change the scale of human civilization itself. NASA's own Moon to Mars framework describes Artemis as part of a gradual buildup toward living and working on another world, followed by human missions to Mars. So when we look at Artemis, we are not just watching another launch campaign. We are watching a species decide whether its greatest explorations are behind it or still ahead. That is why Artemis feels larger than a rocket, a capsule, or even a return to the moon. It is a test of memory, a test of ambition, a test of whether we still believe that the future can be bigger than the past. Because if Artemis succeeds, the moon will no longer be the place humanity once went. It will become the place humanity went back to, and then refused to leave. And so, after more than half a century of waiting, the moon is no longer just a memory. Through Artemis, it is becoming a destination again, not as the final prize in a geopolitical race, but as the first step in a much larger future. A future that could include lunar bases, regular missions beyond Earth orbit, and someday, the first human footsteps on Mars. That is the promise of Artemis. Not simply that we can return to the moon, but that we can finally begin building a permanent human presence beyond our home planet. The road ahead will not be simple. Schedules will shift, hardware will be tested, missions will evolve. There will be setbacks, redesigns, political debates, and moments when progress feels slower than anyone wants. But that has always been the nature of exploration. The path forward is rarely straight. What matters is that it is moving again. For the first time in generations, humanity is not just looking outward and wondering what comes next. We are building the machines, training the crews, and laying the foundation to find out. Artemis is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the next chapter. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Orbital Briefing. I'm Ron Walker, and I appreciate you spending this time with me as we explore the people, machines, and missions that have carried humanity into space. New episodes of Orbital Briefing drop every other Thursday, and next time, we'll take a deep dive into one of the most vital and overlooked engineering achievements in the history of spaceflight, the Space Shuttle Heat Shield. Until then, keep looking up.
Thanks for listening to Orbital Briefing. This show is hosted by Ron Walker and is a production of Retrojet Studios. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to follow the show, leave a review, and share it with a fellow space enthusiast. To follow all things space, visit retrojetstudios.com. Until next time, keep looking up.